Welcome back. Welcome to the Premier Mindset by Premier Performance LLC. I'm your host, Trent Mailer, LCSW, licensed clinical therapist and performance coach, and this is episode 71. There's a good chance the biggest competitor standing between you and your potential isn't the athlete across the field. It isn't the team you're preparing to play next weekend. It isn't the coach making difficult decisions or the pressure of a championship game. It might be the device sitting in your pocket that you willingly open dozens of times every single day. That's uncomfortable to hear because social media feels normal now. It's woven into almost every part of modern athletics. Recruiting happens there. NIL opportunities happen there. Personal brands are built there. Teammates communicate there. Highlights are shared there. So when someone says social media might actually be hurting your performance, it's easy to dismiss the idea as outdated or overly dramatic. But that's not what we're talking about today. I'm not here to tell you to delete every app on your phone. I'm here to ask you a much more important question. Is social media helping build your performance, or is it quietly becoming your strongest psychological opponent? One of the biggest mistakes athletes make is believing performance only happens inside the weight room, on the practice field, or during competition. Performance is happening long before you ever lace up your shoes. Every environment you consistently expose yourself to is training something inside your mind. Your attention is being trained. Your emotional reactions are being trained. Your confidence is being trained. Your expectations are being trained. The question isn't whether your environment is influencing you. The question is whether it's shaping you into the competitor you're trying to become or pulling you further away from that version of yourself. Social media isn't just something you consume. Over time, it becomes an environment that quietly begins consuming you. Quick note before we fully dive in. This podcast is for education and performance growth. It's not a replacement for therapy or medical treatment. If there's something you need, make sure you go and get it. With that, our own social media accounts are all linked in the episode description. So get involved in those communities as we continue to grow them, and we'll continue to talk about social media in different ways and how these things can be helpful and used in helpful ways. Now, getting back into it. Think about how often this happens without you even noticing. You finish an incredible workout. You hit numbers you've never hit before. Your conditioning is improving. Your coach compliments your effort. You walk out of practice feeling genuinely proud of the work you put in. Then you sit down in your car before driving home and decide to scroll for just a few minutes. Within moments, you're watching another athlete deadlift more than you. Someone else just committed to a D1 school. Another player signed a major NIL deal. Someone posts a professionally edited highlight reel that makes them look unstoppable. Another athlete is training in a facility that looks like something built for professional sports. 10 minutes ago, you felt confident. 10 minutes later, you start wondering whether you're actually good enough. Nothing changed physically. Your body didn't become weaker. Your preparation didn't suddenly disappear. Your skills didn't decline. The only thing that changed was the information entering your mind. That is why social media is so psychologically powerful. It can change how you feel about yourself without changing anything about who you actually are. That's one of the reasons comparisons has become one of the most dangerous opponents in modern sports. Most athletes assume comparison is something they consciously choose to do. In reality, comparison is increasingly becoming something your environment trains you to do automatically. Every scroll teaches your brain to measure who's faster, who's stronger, who has more followers, who received a better offer, who has a better body, who has better equipment, who has better opportunities. Eventually, your brain stops asking, how am I improving? And starts asking, how do I compare? Those questions sound similar, but they produce completely different competitors. One creates growth, the other creates insecurity. The fastest way to lose confidence isn't to get worse. It's to measure your life against thousands of carefully edited moments that were never meant to represent reality. Listen to that again, because it's one of the biggest psychological traps athletes fall into today. You're comparing your ordinary Tuesday afternoon to someone else's best 15 seconds. You're comparing your behind-the-scenes struggles to someone else's professionally edited highlight reel. You're comparing your chapter 3 to someone else's chapter 20. No competitor wins that comparison because it was never designed to be fair in the first place. One of the things I see repeatedly when working with athletes is that confidence rarely disappears all at once. People often tell me they suddenly lost belief in themselves. But when we slow everything down and examine what actually happened, it usually wasn't sudden at all. Confidence eroded gradually. It was chipped away by hundreds of tiny moments that felt insignificant on their own. One comparison here, another highlight reel there, a recruiting announcement, a teammate's viral video, an influencer claiming there's one secret training method everyone else is missing. None of those moments seem powerful individually, but together they begin changing how you evaluate yourself. Eventually you stop appreciating your own progress because someone else's progress always feels bigger. One exercise I want you to begin using is what I call the digital performance audit. I don't want you to immediately change anything. I simply want you to become aware. For the next week, pay attention to how you feel before opening social media and how you feel after closing it. Don't judge yourself, just observe. Do you leave feeling motivated or do you leave feeling smaller? Do you become more focused or does your attention scatter? Do you feel energized to train or do you suddenly feel like everything you've accomplished isn't enough? High performers don't optimize what they refuse to measure. Before you change your habits, you have to understand what your current habits are actually producing. What makes this especially dangerous is that social media doesn't always damage confidence by making you feel worse. Sometimes it damages confidence by making you chase the wrong things. An athlete starts caring more about posting workouts than completing them with intention. A recovery session becomes content instead of recovery. A practice becomes something to film instead of something to learn from. Improvement slowly becomes performance theater. The goal quietly shifts from becoming elite to appearing elite. That's a subtle shift, but it changes everything because your attention is now split between your actual development and everyone else's perception of your development. Elite performance demands deep focus, yet social media rewards divided attention. The competitor who spends years mastering fundamentals often loses attention to the competitor posting dramatic transformations every week. Your brain begins expecting constant novelty because that's exactly what the algorithm is built to deliver. Every swipe brings something different. Another video, another opinion, another highlight, another controversy, another shortcut. Then you walk into practice where mastery requires repetition, patience, and doing the same movement correctly thousands of times. Your nervous system has been trained for constant stimulation, but your sport rewards disciplined consistency. Those two environments are moving in opposite directions. That's why I encourage athletes to think about what I call the input versus output ratio. Ask yourself a simple question. Am I spending more time consuming other people's performance than building my own? Because every hour spent watching someone else's discipline is an hour not invested in your own. There's nothing wrong with learning from great athletes. There's tremendous value in studying excellence. There's a point where inspiration quietly becomes substitution. Watching elite performance is not the same as creating elite performance. Your brain will sometimes confuse the two if you're not intentional. There's another tool I want you to carry with you throughout this episode because it becomes increasingly important as competition gets harder. I call it the comparison interrupt. The moment you notice yourself measuring your worth against someone else's post, interrupt the thought with one question. What information here actually helps me become better? If the answer is nothing, keep scrolling or just close the app. If the answer is something useful, a training idea, a recovery strategy, a mindset insight, take the lesson and leave the comparison behind. High performers extract value without absorbing unnecessary emotional baggage. That's a skill. And like every skill, it improves with repetition. The reality is that social media isn't asking you to compare yourself once a week. It's asking you to compare yourself hundreds of times a day. Every recruiting commitment, every sponsorship announcement, every physique transformation, every championship celebration. Every viral clip becomes another opportunity for your mind to question whether you're doing enough. Eventually, you begin carrying invisible opponents into every workout. Not the people standing next to you, but the hundreds of strangers you watched before practice even started. You aren't just competing against your schedule anymore. You're competing against an endless stream of carefully curated excellence that never sleeps. That's why your most important scoreboard can never be the one on your phone. It has to become what I call your internal scoreboard. Every day, ask yourself whether you honored your training plan, executed with discipline, learned something valuable, and became slightly better than yesterday. Those are measurements you control. Those are measurements that compound over months and years. The external scoreboard will always fluctuate because someone will always be faster, richer, stronger, or more visible. The internal scoreboard is where sustainable confidence is built because it measures effort, consistency, growth, and integrity instead of popularity. By the time you finish this episode, I don't necessarily want you spending less time online. I want you becoming far more intentional about how that environment shapes you, because confidence usually isn't stolen in one dramatic moment. It is quietly borrowed, one comparison at a time. And if you don't recognize that process while it's happening, you'll eventually start believing your confidence disappeared on its own, when in reality, you unknowingly handed pieces of it away every single day. Part of becoming an elite competitor in today's world isn't just training your body. It's learning to protect your mind from environments that quietly train it in the wrong direction. In the next part, we're going to go even deeper because comparison isn't what it used to be. You're no longer competing against reality. Increasingly, you're competing against algorithms, artificial intelligence, and digital perfection that was never real to begin with. If the first part was about realizing social media influences your confidence, this next part is about realizing it is beginning to influence who you believe you are. That is a completely different conversation. Confidence rises and falls. Identity becomes the lens through which you interpret everything. Once your identity begins depending on what you consume online, your performance no longer belongs entirely to you. It belongs, at least in part, to whatever captures your attention that day. That is one of the quietest shifts happening in sports, and most athletes never realize it until years later. There was a time when comparison had limits. You compared yourself to the athletes on your team, maybe the best player in your conference, or the opponent standing across from you on the game day. There were natural boundaries around who occupied your mental space. Today, those boundaries no longer exist. Before breakfast, you can compare yourself to an Olympian in Australia, a professional athlete in Europe, a high school freshman going viral in Texas, and a fitness influencer whose entire career revolves around looking impressive on camera. Your brain was never designed to process that volume of comparison. Yet now we treat it as completely normal. The dangerous part is that your brain doesn't distinguish between meaningful comparisons and meaningless ones. It simply registers information. Every time you see someone who appears more successful, stronger, faster, wealthier, or more recognized, your brain begins asking a question that often stays below conscious awareness. Where do I fit? If that question gets asked enough times without intention, your identity slowly becomes something to negotiate with the internet instead of something you build through disciplined action. Then artificial intelligence, AI, enters the equation, and it raises the difficulty even further. We're moving into an era where not every image reflects reality. Not every video shows exactly what happened. Not every transformation occurred naturally. Not every speech was written by the person delivering it. Not every highlight represents consistent performance. Technology now makes it easier than ever to create perfection, but your nervous system still responds as though everything you see is authentic. You aren't simply comparing yourself to highly curated lives anymore. Increasingly, you're comparing yourself to content that may have been enhanced, manipulated, or partially generated before you even saw it. That creates a psychological burden previous generations of athletes never had to carry. Your standards are no longer being shaped by reality. They're being shaped by an algorithm whose objective isn't your development. Its objective is your attention. That's an important distinction because those two goals often point in opposite directions. Elite performance requires patience, repetition, humility, and delayed gratification. Algorithms reward immediacy, novelty, emotional reactions, and constant engagement. One builds champions, the other builds consumers. Think about a locker room 30 minutes before competition. This isn't the dramatic speech scene from a movie where everyone is locked in and preparing for battle. It's much quieter than that. Half the room has headphones on. Several athletes are scrolling through social media. Someone laughs at a video. Another athlete watches highlights from an opponent who seems unstoppable. Another sees a teammate from another school announcing a major NIL partnership. One player notices comments questioning whether they're ready for today's games. The room is physically together, but mentally, everyone is somewhere else. One athlete pauses on a highlight video of the person they'll be competing against later that afternoon. Every clip is spectacular. Every play looks effortless. Every comment underneath says this athlete is the future of the sport. Suddenly, months of disciplined preparation begins feeling smaller. Nothing about today's competition has changed, yet internally, everything has changed. That athlete walks onto the field carrying an unnecessary psychological weight that wasn't created by the opponent. It was created by 5 minutes of scrolling. That is how identity quietly becomes outsourced. You stop asking, who have I become through my preparation? And start asking, how do I compare to what I'm seeing? Those are fundamentally different questions. One produces grounded confidence because it's rooted in evidence. The other produces emotional instability because it's rooted in perception. Performance begins long before the opening whistle, and many athletes unknowingly lose part of that battle before competition even starts. This is where I want to introduce what I call the identity anchor exercise. Before every practice, competition, or meaningful training session, ask yourself 3 questions. Who am I when nobody is watching? What have I consistently done to prepare for this moment? What values am I bringing into today's performance, regardless of the outcome? Those questions anchor your identity to behaviors you control instead of opinions you can't. The strongest competitors don't eliminate outside noise. They simply know where their identity lives before the noise ever arrives. Another skill that has become essential is developing what I call a reality filter. Every time you consume content online, remind yourself that you're rarely seeing the whole story. You're seeing selected moments. You're seeing edited decisions. You're seeing camera angles, timing, lighting, music, and presentation. You're almost never seeing the doubts, setbacks, failed repetitions, injuries, anxiety, difficult conversations, or lonely hours that actually built the performance. If you compare your entire life to someone else's highlights without applying that filter, you will consistently underestimate yourself and overestimate everyone else. One of the most concerning shifts I've noticed is how often athletes begin making career decisions based on visibility instead of development. They start wondering which school will create the biggest social media following instead of which environment will help them improve. They choose training locations because they look impressive online. They prioritize exercises that create great videos over fundamentals that actually translate into competition. Visibility starts replacing effectiveness. Recognition starts replacing mastery. The image slowly becomes more important than the substance. That's exactly what algorithms encourage because visibility is measurable. Likes are measurable. Views are measurable. Followers are measurable. Those numbers create the illusion of certainty. Improvement doesn't work that way. Progress is often quiet. It isn't always obvious from week to week. Mastery rarely goes viral because mastery is repetitive. It looks like showing up on days when nobody is filming. It looks like doing fundamentals over and over again long after they stop feeling exciting. The algorithm doesn't care if you become great. It only cares if you stay engaged. Those are 2 completely different goals. If you remember nothing else from this episode, remember that. Your mission and the algorithm's mission are not aligned. One wants to keep your attention. The other requires you to direct your attention with discipline. Every minute you spend inside the environment without intention increases the chances that someone else begins deciding what deserves your focus. That's why I encourage athletes to develop an intention recovery protocol. Whenever you catch yourself getting pulled into comparison or emotional overload, don't immediately jump into training. Give yourself a few intentional minutes to reset. Put the phone away. Take a walk. Breathe. Review your training plan. Reconnect with the reason you're practicing today. The goal isn't simply to stop scrolling. The goal is to ensure your attention returns to you before your performance begins. Elite competitors understand that attention is a limited resource. They refuse to waste it before they need it most. I also want you to begin using what I call the social media intentionality check. Before opening any platform, ask yourself one simple question. Why am I opening this right now? If your answer is to learn something specific, connect with someone meaningful, or intentionally share your work, that's purposeful use. If your answer is boredom, habit, anxiety, or simply because your hand reached for your phone automatically, you've already given away control. High performers don't eliminate technology. They eliminate unconscious behavior. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Social media isn't competing against your free time anymore. It's competing against your focus, your confidence, your identity, and your ability to perform under pressure. Those are the exact same psychological resources that elite athletics depends on. Every unnecessary comparison taxes them. Every emotionally charged scroll drains them. Every hour spent chasing someone else's life is an hour your own development isn't receiving your full attention. The greatest competitors I've ever worked with aren't necessarily the ones who avoid social media altogether. They're the ones who never allow it to become the loudest voice shaping how they see themselves. Their preparation speaks louder than public opinion. Their habits speak louder than highlight reels. Their standards come from inside their training process, not from outside validation. That doesn't happen accidentally. It happens because they intentionally protect their identity before they ever protect their image. And that leads us into the next part of this conversation, because awareness alone isn't enough. Recognizing the problem doesn't automatically solve it. You can understand exactly how social media is influencing you and still fall into the same patterns tomorrow morning. The question becomes, how do you actually rebuild control? How do you train your attention instead of letting the digital environment train it for you? Because confidence, focus, and emotional discipline aren't personality traits. They're trainable performance skills. And that's exactly where we're going next. One of the biggest mistakes athletes make after hearing everything we've talked about so far is assuming the solution is to delete every social media app and disappear from the internet. That's not what I'm saying. Social media isn't inherently good or bad. It's a tool. And like every tool, its impact depends on who is holding it and whether they're using it intentionally or being used by it. Elite performers don't become elite by avoiding every distraction life presents. They become elite because they learn how to regulate themselves inside distracting environments. That's a completely different skill. And it's one that becomes more valuable every single year. The real opponent isn't Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, or whatever platform comes next. The real opponent is unmanaged relationships with those platforms. That's an important distinction because if you convince yourself that the platform is the problem, you're giving away your power. If the platform controls your confidence, then your confidence was never actually yours. But if you recognize that your habits, your boundaries, and your attention determine the relationship, suddenly you have something you can train. And that's exactly how I want you thinking from this point forward. Performance psychology has always been about managing limited resources. Energy is limited, recovery is limited, time is limited. Attention might be the most valuable limited resource you have because every decision you make begins with where your attention goes first. If your attention is constantly scattered, your performance eventually becomes scattered too. You don't drift into excellence. You direct yourself there. Every championship season, every successful business, every meaningful career is built one intentional decision at a time. And intentional decisions require intentional attention. One concept I want you to understand is something called attentional residue. Imagine you're reading a book while someone beside you keeps saying your name every 30 seconds. Even if you never look over, part of your brain is constantly monitoring that interruption. It never fully settles into the task in front of it. That's what happens every time you bounce between training, texts, notifications, highlight videos, comments, and messages. Physically, you're in the weight room, on the field, or in the gym. Mentally, part of you is still somewhere else. That's why so many athletes tell me they're working just as hard as they used to, but they don't feel as locked in. Their work ethic didn't disappear. Their attention became divided. Focus isn't just about effort. Focus is about cognitive availability. If 50% of your mind is still processing everything you consumed before practice even started, you never actually arrived mentally. Your body showed up. Your nervous system didn't. This is where the performance first rule becomes incredibly important. The rule is simple. Before you consume someone else's performance, produce your own. Before you watch highlights, make your own reps. Before you read comments, create something worth commenting on. Before you spend 20 minutes watching another athlete work, spend 20 minutes becoming a better athlete yourself. It sounds almost too simple, but psychologically, it changes everything because it teaches your brain that action comes before consumption instead of the other way around. Think about how differently your day begins when the first thing your brain experiences is progress instead of comparison. You finish your lift, you complete your sprint work, you study film, you complete recovery. Now, if you decide to open social media afterward, you're viewing it from a position of accomplishment instead of insecurity. You've already made a confidence deposit before exposing yourself to an environment that often tries to withdraw confidence. That's a fundamentally different psychological experience. That idea of confidence deposits is another system I want you to begin using immediately. Most athletes unknowingly wait for confidence to arrive before they perform. Elite performers understand confidence is earned through repeated evidence. Every workout completed, every difficult conversation handled well, every recovery session honored, every uncomfortable drill repeated until it became second nature. Those are confidence deposits. Likes aren't. Followers aren't. Views aren't. Those things may create excitement, but excitement and confidence are not the same thing. Confidence built on external validation disappears the moment external validation slows down. Confidence built on mastery becomes remarkably difficult for the outside world to shake because it's rooted in evidence your own nervous system experienced firsthand. That's why I keep encouraging athletes to keep a private performance journal. Not because journaling is trendy, but because your brain remembers emotionally intense moments far better than quiet progress. A written record reminds you of all the work your emotions conveniently forgot whenever comparison begins whispering that you're falling behind. I also want you thinking about something I call your intention budget. Every single day you wake up with a finite amount of cognitive currency. You can spend it however you want, but once it's gone, it's gone. The mistake many athletes make is spending 80% of that budget reacting to other people before investing anything into themselves. They respond to notifications, consume content, compare careers, chase news, and mentally travel through hundreds of lives before they've intentionally invested 5 focused minutes into their own development. Then they wonder why their attention feels bankrupt by afternoon. The best competitors budget attention the same way elite organizations budget money. They know where it goes before the day begins. They decide what deserves mental investment instead of allowing algorithms to make that decision for them. That doesn't eliminate distraction forever. It simply means distraction no longer has unlimited access to your psychology. That's an enormous competitive advantage because every unnecessary decision drains energy that could have been invested into improvement. Another strategy I want you to begin implementing is the digital recovery windows. Every athlete understands physical recovery. You wouldn't expect your body to perform optimally after endless high-intensity training without rest. Yet many athletes expect their brains to remain focused after hours of constant digital stimulation. Recovery isn't only physical anymore. Modern recovery includes periods where your nervous system experiences silence from digital input, no notifications, no endless scrolling, no constant novelty competing for your attention. Those recovery windows allow your brain to recalibrate its baseline. Suddenly, ordinary training feels engaging again. Conversation becomes easier to stay present in. Film study becomes less mentally exhausting. Your ability to tolerate boredom improves. And boredom is actually one of the hidden gateways to deep focus. Elite training often isn't endlessly exciting. Sometimes greatness is built through repetitive, ordinary work. Social media conditions your brain to expect novelty every few seconds. Recovery teaches your brain how to appreciate sustained effort again. This also connects directly to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is doing something because the process itself matters. Extrinsic motivation depends on outside rewards. Social media naturally amplifies extrinsic motivation because nearly every interaction provides measurable feedback. Views, likes, shares, followers, comments. The danger isn't that these things exist. The danger is allowing them to become the primary reason you train. When your motivation slowly shifts towards being seen instead of becoming better, your relationship with adversity changes. Hard workouts feel less meaningful if nobody records them. Quiet improvements feel less valuable if it doesn't receive recognition. Consistency becomes harder because your brain has learned to expect immediate feedback for every meaningful effort. But elite performance has never worked that way. Championships are usually built through thousands of repetitions that almost nobody witnesses. I remember realizing this in my own work after posting content online. There were moments where I'd finished creating something I genuinely believed would help people, and instead of moving directly into the next meaningful task, I'd catch myself checking engagement, then checking again, then wondering if it was performing well. Nothing about the quality of the work had changed. The work was finished. The only thing changing was where my attention kept drifting. I realized how quickly external feedback could begin negotiating with internal purpose if I didn't intentionally manage that relationship. That experience reminded me of something I now tell athletes all the time. Protect the mission that existed before anyone was watching. If your purpose changes every time the audience changes, then the audience has become your coach. That's an incredibly dangerous place to live because audiences are unpredictable. Algorithms are unpredictable. Public opinion is unpredictable. Your standards can't be. This leads into one of the most important questions I think every athlete should regularly ask themselves. Would I still do today's workout if nobody ever saw it? If the answer is yes, you're building something durable. If the answer is no, it's worth examining whether your motivation has slowly migrated from growth toward visibility. That's not something to judge yourself for. It's something to become aware of before it quietly redirects your career. I also want to reinforce the comparison interrupt we introduced earlier because awareness alone doesn't stop comparison. The moment you notice yourself mentally measuring your life against someone else's highlight reel, interrupt the pattern with evidence. Ask yourself, what have I done today that moves me closer to my own goals? That single question immediately redirects your attention from somebody else's journey back to your own process. Comparison thrives in vague thinking. Progress becomes visible when you ask specific questions. The same is true for your input versus output ratio. Every day you should contain significantly more creation than consumption, more training than scrolling, more practice than watching practice, more studying than reacting, more execution than observation. Observation has value, but only when it fuels execution instead of replacing it. Too many athletes mistake consuming information for applying information. They know more than ever while performing below their potential because knowledge without deliberate action never becomes performance. By this point, I hope you're beginning to see that social media isn't simply competing for your time. It's competing for your identity, your confidence, your emotional regulation, your motivation, and ultimately your future performance. The encouraging part is that all of those things remain trainable. Your attention can become stronger. Your confidence can become steadier. Your relationships with technology can become healthier. None of that happens accidentally. It happens because you intentionally build systems that protect the mind you're asking to perform at an elite level. And that's the shift I want you leaving this section with. Confidence is not built by repeatedly exposing yourself to people who appear ahead of you. Confidence is built through repeated experiences of mastery that your own nervous system can trust. Every focused rep, every disciplined decision, every time you choose your mission over momentary validation, you are teaching your brain something powerful. You're teaching it that your future will be determined by what you consistently practice, not by what you consistently scroll. What fascinates me is that the greatest competitors I've ever been around don't necessarily have the greatest discipline because they were born different. They have better boundaries. They understand something that most people miss. Every yes you give your attention is automatically a no to something else. Every hour spent consuming someone else's life is an hour not invested in building your own. Every emotional reaction to someone else's success quietly drains emotional energy away from your own preparation. Eventually, you realize championships are rarely lost in one dramatic moment. They're often lost one distracted decision at a time. The athlete who can repeatedly return their attention to what actually matters begins creating a separation that isn't obvious today, but becomes impossible to ignore 5 years from now. One of the biggest mistakes I see is athletes treating digital discipline like punishment instead of recognizing it as preparation. They think limiting social media means they're missing out. In reality, they're making room for something far more valuable. Every elite performer has things they intentionally don't consume because they understand that protecting focus isn't restrictive, it's freeing. When your attention belongs to everyone else, your performance eventually does too. But when your attention belongs to your mission, your training begins to feel lighter. Your confidence becomes steadier, and your emotions stop rising and falling with whatever happens to appear on your screen that day. That isn't luck. That's intentional psychological training. This is where I want to revisit something we introduced earlier, your internal scoreboard. High performers eventually reach a point where external validation simply cannot become the primary measurement system anymore. Your scoreboard has to become internal because external scoreboards are constantly changing. One post gets more engagement than another. One athlete suddenly goes viral. Someone signs a sponsorship. Someone announces a transfer. Someone lands an NIL deal. If your confidence follows every one of these moments, then you've handed strangers permission to influence your performance. An internal scoreboard asks different questions. Did you execute your training today? Did you recover well? Did you become 1% better? Did you live according to your standards instead of reacting to someone else's success? Those are measurements you actually control. As you continue developing, I also want you to build something I call long-term attention planning. Most athletes plan workouts, nutrition, travel. Very few intentionally plan where their attention will live over the next year. Yet intention determines the quality of every decision that follows. Long-term attention planning simply asks you to become proactive instead of reactive. Decide what deserves your attention before the world decides it for you. Decide what voices earn influence. Decide what platforms actually contribute to your goals. Decide what information improves your performance and what information simply creates noise. Every intentional decision makes the next one easier. That naturally leads into digital boundaries. Notice I didn't say digital avoidance. Social media itself isn't the enemy. Used intentionally, it's an incredible tool. You can learn from experts across the world. You can build meaningful relationships. You can create opportunities that previous generations of athletes never had. You can educate, inspire, and even build a career beyond your sport. But tools require discipline. A hammer can build a house or destroy one, depending on how it's used. Social media works the same way. The goal isn't to eliminate it. The goal is to make sure you're using it instead of allowing it to use you. One practice I encourage almost every athlete to adopt is a weekly digital performance review. Not a review of your content, a review of your relationship with content. Once each week, spend 5 minutes asking yourself honest questions. When did social media help me this week? When did it distract me? Did I consume it intentionally or automatically? Did I leave feeling more prepared or more anxious? Did it move me closer to my goals or further away from them? Awareness is powerful because patterns lose strength once they're brought into the light. Most people never evaluate their digital habits. They simply just repeat them. Another tool that becomes increasingly important over time is what I call an identity reset conversation. Sometimes that conversation happens with a coach. Sometimes it happens with a teammate. Sometimes with a mentor, a therapist, or a trusted friend. Sometimes it's simply a conversation you have with yourself in a journal. The purpose is simple. Remind yourself who you are outside of performance metrics and outside of digital validation. You're not your follower count. You're not your scholarship offer. You're not your sponsorship. You're not your latest race, game, or season. Those are outcomes. Identity has to live somewhere deeper than outcomes because outcomes will always fluctuate. If your identity rises and falls with every result, you'll spend your career emotionally exhausted. I also want to challenge coaches, parents, and leaders who are listening. This conversation isn't only about athletes. The environments you create matter. If every conversation revolves around visibility instead of development, don't be surprised when athletes begin valuing appearance over improvement. Celebrate discipline as much as outcomes. Recognize consistency as much as highlights. Reinforce character as much as statistics. The culture you create teaches athletes what deserves attention long before you ever say it directly. Think about the athletes you admire most. Chances are, what separates them isn't simply physical ability, it's presence. When practice starts, they're actually there. When competition begins, they're emotionally available. They aren't carrying the emotional weight of 50 videos they watched that morning. They aren't mentally arguing with anonymous comments. They aren't replaying someone else's highlight reel in their head. They're immersed in the only moment capable of improving performance, the one directly in front of them. And maybe that's the greatest cost of uncontrolled social media use. It doesn't just consume time, it steals presence. Presence is where trust is built. Presence is where confidence grows. Presence is where learning happens. Presence is where great teammates are formed. Presence is where championships are won. If your attention constantly lives somewhere else, eventually your potential does too. Here's the truth I hope stays with you long after this episode ends. Many athletic careers won't end because someone else was more talented. They'll end because attention slowly drifted away from improvement and toward performance theater. The tragedy isn't losing a championship. The tragedy is spending years becoming exceptionally skilled at looking like an elite athlete while quietly drifting further away from becoming one. There's never been a generation with more information available. Yet there's also never been a generation forced to fight harder to protect its attention. That isn't your fault, but it is your responsibility. So before you open another app today, pause and ask yourself one question. Is what I'm about to consume helping me become the competitor I want to be? Or is it simply helping the algorithm keep my attention a little longer? These answers shape careers more than people realize. At Premier Performance, this is exactly why we focus on more than motivation. Motivation fades. Education alone isn't enough either, because knowing what to do and consistently doing it are two different things. Sustainable high performance comes from building systems of accountability, strengthening psychological skills, designing environments that support excellence, and training your mind with the same intentionality you train your body. Whether we're working with individual athletes, teams, coaches, or organizations, the goal is always the same. Create environments where elite performance can actually last. And because at the highest level, talent is common, but opportunity is limited. Attention is priceless. The athletes who separate themselves aren't always the strongest, the fastest, or even the most naturally gifted. They're the ones who refuse to let the world decide what deserves their attention. Because where your attention goes, your performance eventually follows. Resilient minds, premier results. That's what we're building here with the Premier Mindset and what we're going to continue to keep building upon. As always, recognition is the first step. If you don't know something is happening, you can't do anything about it. With that, this episode is meant to provide tools for performance, not replace individualized therapy. If you're struggling with anxiety, burnout, or persistent stress, professional guidance is critical. At Premier Performance LLC, we work with high achievers to implement strategies like these with precision, accountability, and results. I make it a point to give you actionable tools to find success in your life. Let me know if it's helping. I love staying connected with you all. I want to hear about the successes, the failures, and everything in between. I'd also love to hear how this episode itself impacts you. So share it with somebody if you feel like they need to hear it, if you think they're going to benefit from it. Reach out if you have questions about it, and leave a review if you liked it. The more reviews, the better, because it gets in front of more people, and that's our ultimate goal. If you do want to reach out about anything, there's a lot of ways to do it. You can email me at tmailer@premierperformancereno.com. My last name spelled Mahler. You can text or call me directly at 775-561-0056. The Instagram and the TikTok both have the same name, which is Premier_Performance_Reno for both of those. We have the Facebook page and the LinkedIn page, which is Premier Performance LLC for both of those. And then we have the Twitter or the X account, which is @Premier Reno LLC. And finally, our website, which is www.premierperformancereno.com. So get involved, get engaged, keep being the best you can. We're going to continue to put out podcasts every week. And next week, we're going to dive into an interview focusing on elite performance and different aspects of life. So we'll get into that. But I hope you guys have a great week. Do the best you can. Put yourself in a position to be better than you ever could be and surprise yourself by doing some hard things. And don't be afraid to fail. If you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, have a great one, and I will see you guys soon.